Under the United Nations brokered deal, both sides will free more than 1,000 prisoners and detainees, steps aimed at reviving a stalled peace process. Elisabeth Kendall is Senior Research Fellow in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford University's Pembroke College. Elisabeth, a spokesperson for the Saudi-led forces, described this prisoner swap deal as, quote, a positive agreement. Let's listen.
The aim behind this agreement is purely humanitarian. It will also establish a solid base for dialogue between Yemeni parties and for reaching a comprehensive political solution in Yemen.
So, Elisabeth, there we heard it as well from that spokesman, the Saudi spokesman, saying that this deal is purely humanitarian, making the distinction that don't read too much into it. But do you believe that it could lead to some kind of a political settlement?
Well, naturally, the hope is there that it's the start along a path of something greater. In fact, the extract you just played, he did say the hope is that it will lead somehow to a broader political solution and a ceasefire. But we need a bit of a reality check on this. Even when the Stockholm Agreement was signed at the end of 2018, it was just for a ceasefire for one port and its governorate called Hodeidah. It was an understanding for Taiz, and it was a much more extensive prisoner swap. Almost 2 years later, that has not come to anything. So it's much easier to agree these kinds of swaps than it is to implement them. I think we need to see whether this is implemented. If it is, then yes, it can be considered a trust-building measure and maybe a tiny step on the way to peace. But if it isn't, then it could have the opposite effect. It could actually make matters worse and lessen the trust.
What are your thoughts on a political solution moving forward?
It's difficult, I think, for the US and the UK to have a credible voice in that when we are selling weapons to combatants in the war. And while those weapons are killing civilians, which they are, naturally, of course, the Houthis have committed despicable atrocities as well. The difference is that we are not selling them weapons. We're selling them to the Saudi-led coalition. What the UN needs to do as the neutral body around here is listen more to Yemenis. I don't think we should be asking people like me, really, how to solve the Yemen crisis. We should be listening to Yemeni voices. And I've been very pleased to see the UN move a little bit away from the same old elites being wheeled out for the same old consultations to try to bring in a much broader range of voices, including civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, more women, some youth voices, to try to figure out how a peace, when it is finally agreed, could be rolled out on the ground and not just to rely on the same old players and certainly not on just the two main players, the Houthis and the coalition.
But where does one bring in those voices, Elisabeth? Where is the forum going to be created to hear what people in Yemen have to say?
I think high-level consultations that are conducted by the UN need to have a mechanism, either around the outside or a preparatory mechanism, to try to bring in those voices. It's much more difficult now during virus times, but the UN is making an effort. It has an extensive online platform for engaging such voices. You can go to the Office of the Special Envoy's Twitter feed and read a bit about it. Now, I'm not being idealistic here. It really isn't the ideal way of bringing in Yemeni voices. Of course, you need internet access. You need to be selected just for this consultation. But it is better than not including any of these voices. Ideally, I would like to see the UN and others try to create, with the help of Yemenis, a framework for much better inclusion of the different regions around Yemen in a peace process, so that when something is actually signed, it might actually be implemented.